Hi, good morning. Thank you all for inviting me here today. I'm not a youth worker, so I'm feeling somewhat like an outsider, but still quite welcome. I wanted to talk to you about some research that I'm doing on intergenerational, low-carbon, and climate-resilient communities. And I've titled it here, European Practices for Centering Youth Participation in Urban Climate Governance, but I think we'll talk maybe more a bit about some of the challenges to doing so. So you'll hear I have a slight accent, and that is because I am American. I came to Berlin about a year ago on a Alexander von Humboldt Foundation fellowship to really do independent research. And so I just share that to say that the research is not necessarily in response to a grant opportunity or some work that an institution was doing, but I'm here really doing research that is personally and professionally of interest. Like I said, I am not a youth worker. This is not my field. I am simply by some definitions, formally a youth, and other definitions, I'm just still right in there. But my background is in urban planning and community economic development. I have been working on expanding access to green spaces, affordable housing, working in community economic development, kind of the thinking around shared ownership models like cooperatives and land trust. And most recently, I was working with a regional climate collaborative in Southeast Florida. And so this was a network of cities that say, hey, we should partner with each other, figure out what we can learn as we're addressing our rising seas. And they said, you know, we're spending lots of money a year, billions of dollars on certain projects, and we are prioritizing certain areas for certain groups, and we should have some scrutiny about how we do this work. So let's think deeply about our community engagement and our outreach. And as they were doing this work, I think, they were getting some pats on the backs from, groups like the Environmental Defense Fund that said, hey, it's really good that you're doing this work. And they were getting, I would say, quite critical feedback from groups that were either had a large youth membership or were serving primarily youth groups. And they said, hey, it's nice that you're building flood walls, but there's so much more that you can do. This is not a community that should only be focused on resilience, but really thinking about how do we reduce our emissions in a way that serves our community. And this was a place, I'm putting just a few sort of impacts of climate change that you experience. So they were saying, okay, we need to be aware of urban heat island. We need to be aware that not everyone can pay for air conditioning. We're having a lot of heat deaths in our community. How are we serving those groups? How are we ensuring that infrastructure that is vulnerable is not just roads, but how do we ensure that our hospitals are prepared for in emergency situations? And I think I was telling someone, some of these issues that people were facing would surprise you. I would say like dengue fever, which is something I think for most of us you think is only possible when you go on vacation, but this is even spreading in the United States. And so young folks in the community were saying, hey, we have to be really aggressive and thoughtful about how we address climate, not only thinking about how it impacts the economy, but our health and our welfare. At the same time, in addition to Fridays for Future movements, U.S. had we would call this Sunrise Movement, which is really focused on electoral strategies, but to get leaders that were focused on Green Deal. And I was seeing, okay, youth are not just active in this work, but they're really having an impact. And in Germany, I think you'll see especially the impact of the youth is quite well understood. So the Chancellor said in respect to the climate law that was recently passed, the seriousness with which Greta, but also many other young people are telling us that climate change is about their lives and that their lifespans extend further has led us to approach the matter more resolutely. And so with all these kind of personal questions and professional interests, I said, okay, I'm going to spend my year here asking under what conditions do and can youth participate in urban climate governance? So I'm using this term, urban climate governance, I think because I really like it, and I read it to you. So when we describe urban climate governance, we're talking about the ways in which public, private, civil society actors and institutions articulate climate goals, exercise influence and authority, and manage climate planning and implementation processes. I like this research because I think it really spoke to this idea around influence and power. And I would say broadly, when you speak to youth groups who are engaged in climate negotiations, they would say, we are so often taken for just being a part of a photo opportunity and a checkbox to say that we engage the youth. But we have power and we want to figure out how to harness this. And so in my research, I spoke with a variety of groups who are working at kind of urban and regional levels. And this is largely for city staff. And I also spoke with youth and environment groups. So this is a bit of a selection of some of the groups that I spoke to. And what I found is over and over again, this idea of meaningful participation being beyond this consultation and really being able to have some sort of influence was something emphasized. And it was not just me who was finding this to be the case, that meaningful participation was important, but you'll see it in European Youth Goals. So I will read that as well, as we're today talking about meaningful participation. So the EU decides that this means ensuring that young people can adequately influence all areas of society and all parts of the decision-making process, from agenda setting to implementation, monitoring and evaluation, through youth-friendly and accessible mechanisms and structures, ensuring that the policies respond to young people. So today we'll just talk about this at the level of local climate governance. As I was doing the research, I've just a few key findings I wanted to share with you all, and I found that some enabling factors for this work is that local government has some sort of culture of either youth participation and civic engagement. Where I was finding somewhat promising examples, these were communities that really recognize already, that have this as a value, that meaningful participation matters, and staff should be prepared to work in ways that engage young people and the public. Another enabling factor is that youth need to have access to funding to support and reward engagement. I think most people will say, yeah, duh. But in the work, I think folks were finding that, especially when thinking about how to engage people of diverse backgrounds, they were missing out a lot of people when they could only depend on volunteer labor. I think also in some of this work where you're doing really deep engagement, working with hundreds or thousands of people, you simply need time and the ability to support people in doing this work. Another enabling factor, youth should be encouraged and supported to take on leading roles. You'll see also as a challenge here, oftentimes public decision makers, adult decision makers predefine youth goals. And this was often leading to a lack of trust and youth kind of disengaging from the process. And then finally, another enabling factor, which I think this audience here recognizes quickly, is that youth need to see an immediate impact of their engagement. And I did not say this earlier, but this research is really developed for local practitioners developing resilience, sustainability plans, in urban planning. So this is not necessarily the audience that has regular contact with young people, but they're starting to have a directive to do so in their work. So many of these findings you'll say, yeah, duh, I know that, but I think that this research, I'm trying to develop this for an audience where this work is quite new. Some challenges and threats, public decision makers undervalue youth participation. Again, I think that is something that is a theme that we'll find these days, and so one thing I'm trying to uncover in the research is ways that youth participation and youth work can really shine and demonstrate different ways in which they're of service to the community and providing opportunities for young people. And so then let's kind of just go in. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the context in which this work is being done. So why are we even focusing on local? I think much of the discussions that most of us are familiar with are in response to youth participation in national and international climate negotiations. But there's a reason that we're also focusing on youth. And then we're gonna talk about ways in which we've seen the importance of youth participation in climate governance enshrined in policies and charters. Then I'm going to just describe a few emerging practices in centering youth in urban climate governance, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and you all can ask me any questions, but I have a few for you, and if you could just hold some of these in your head. So one is, do you find this research relevant? Are there values of youth work that you think should be expressed to to this audience of urban planners, sustainability and resilience folks. And what are the values of youth work and of youth that you feel like, excuse me, when I say values, I mean values in the sense of like what are the strengths of youth work and youth that you feel like may be misunderstood or not acknowledged at all that you think that this audience would really benefit from knowing. And then finally, I'd love to hear any fears that you have in seeing urban sustainability and resilience professionals engaging in this kind of work. So why local? And I will just read from you from the European Charter on the Participation of Young People in Local and Regional Life, which says, the active participation of young people in decisions and actions at local and regional levels is essential if we are to build more democratic, inclusive, and prosperous societies. Participation and active citizenship is about having the right, the means, the space, and the opportunity, where necessary, to participate in and influence decisions and engage in the actions and activities so as to contribute to building a better society. Okay, so the other reason that we're focusing on local is because a lot of climate change happens here. You know, you feel the impacts of climate change at the local immediately, but also there is an opportunity to reduce emissions at the local site. So local government can deliver or influence just over 50% of carbon savings needed to keep to the 1.5 degree preferred trajectory in the Paris Agreement. And you kind of see in this photo here the ways in which you have control, where climate impacts can be mitigated just in your city. So you can think about, how do we expand access to bike lanes? How do we reduce the use of cars? Is there ways for having more green spaces? And so I say this not just because it's a wish, but a lot of cities are actually planning for this. So in the EU, 4 out of 5 cities have some sort of mitigation or resilience plan. And they're addressing things like land use planning. So how densely are we building? How do we think about sustainability as we organize our cities? How are we ensuring that our buildings are keeping and maintaining the heat or the cooling so that we're not wasting energy? What are the waste management systems that we're supporting? How are we thinking about educating and working with the community so that they know the relevance of climate change in the community? So this work is happening locally. It is not just at the international levels that we're fighting climate change. And then finally, I will describe why this matters in respect to just urban processes generally. I would say throughout the world, cities are really doubling down in how to do more effective community engagement. And in the European Union, the recently released New Leipzig Charter even says that public participation in urban development should engage all urban actors. And this is thought to strengthen local democracy. And wherever possible, citizens should have a say in processes that impact their lives. Experimenting with new forms of participation can help cities to manage conflicts, share responsibilities, and find innovative solutions, while also reshaping and maintaining urban spaces and forming new alliances to create integrated city spaces. Public participation is central to the successful delivery of a high-quality urban environment. All right, I have a lot of background here. I think it's a little tricky in these kind of cross-sectoral work that you gotta kind of understand where everyone is coming from. So I want to move from the local to now where you see youth participation in climate governance, how it shows up. So in 1992, before Greta Thunberg, we already had in the Rio de Janeiro summit, which laid the foundations for the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Agreement, the imperative that youth participate actively in all relevant levels of decision-making processes because it affects their lives today and has implications for their futures. In addition to their intellectual contribution and their ability to mobilize support, they bring unique perspectives that need to be taken into account. And you hear some of this, this thought around why youth must be engaged in climate governance, again, with the International Declaration on Children, Youth, and Climate Action, which was developed in 2019. To date, I think about 15 countries have signed, and in Europe that includes Spain, Monaco, Sweden, Slovenia, and Luxembourg. And the youth said, this was developed by Jungo, and they said that it's important to strengthen the capacity of children and young people on climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts. It is critical to enhance the meaningful participation of children and youth in climate change processes, and that we should adopt institutional and administrative measures to actively pursue these objectives. And this is again echoed at the European level, and the European Economic and Social Committee said, the intergenerational aspect of climate and sustainable development policies and implementation mechanisms needs to be reflected in strong, meaningful youth engagement at all stages of EU decision-making, from drafting of legislative proposals and initiatives through to implementation, monitoring, and follow-up. So I put this kind of chart here to see all the reasons why people think that youth participation matters. So from things as the value for enhancing our transparency and faith in democracy, from supporting the rights of youth to participate, supporting social cohesion in our community, to improving policy, to providing a space for youth to grow. And I put this chart here only to show that when you have this kind of work, you have so many competing actors, values, and goals, and just to keep it in mind, like how do we work through this noise in working with local governments and sustainability professionals? So this is the part that you're probably most interested in, which is what's successful, what's going on. I was looking to see what are the ways that youth can engage at the local and regional level, and I put together a few typologies. Others have written on it. I just kind of changed a few things. So one that we're most familiar with is representative democracy. So this is just going out to vote. And you can think about the ways in which young people are supported to run for office, but also the ways that in which older adults are engaging with young people as they are seeking the vote. Another way of participation at the local level is through youth formal participatory structures, which we are probably all quite familiar with. So things like youth and children's councils, parliaments, or boards. And I have just an example here of the Sonderburg Youth Climate Council in Denmark. Another type of participation is deliberative democracy. This is a process by which youth participate in public deliberation, debate, and consideration prior to actual decision making. So this could be things like a city is developing a new bike master plan. What are their specific ways in which they're engaging youth over months or weeks to get youth to share what is important and relevant to them. I share this example here in Spain, Molina de Seguera, and this is a participatory budgeting process, but not one in which the city said, we have 5 projects, vote on them. This was a process in which the youth came together to identify what would be, what are projects that they would like to put up for a vote. Another typology, which I think is, I think for local government, particularly challenging, but we recognize that much of this work around kind of institutional practices for supporting engagement requires activism and protest beforehand. So this is where there is some tension, and it's independent from public authorities in the state, in which youth strive to influence decision-making through participating in organizing sit-ins, popular education programs, mass demonstration, and other activism activities. And we are, of course, most familiar with this through the Fridays for Future movement. But I'll talk a little bit later about how this is, how we see this manifested on the local level in Krakow to develop a citizens' climate assembly. And then the final youth participation structure that I looked at the local regional level was co-management and co-production. And so these are decision-making bodies in which youth and adults are working together. And I will provide an example of the Manchester Climate Change Partnership in the UK. So in Manchester, which is a city of about 500,000 and a large youth population, about half the city is under age 30. And this was a place with an active youth council, and they've placed goals to be climate neutral by 2038. And they developed a Manchester Climate Change Partnership, which is a collaboration of real estate leaders, faith leaders, businesses, youth, the public sector that was working to advance climate action in the community. And within the partnership, there is, within the partnership, there's a Manchester Climate Change Youth Board, which includes youth representatives, which rotate every few years between the ages of 13 and 28. I think what was quite significant to me is that they had a full-time staff person to go and engage the youth to figure out what are their climate priorities. So this is a full-time staff person who is a youth champion for climate action, who has a background in youth work. And his role currently is to help develop this manifesto on youth priorities. And so they are, this next few months, they're doing kind of neighborhood-based events to meet with youth. They are working with youth councils and other youth groups to bring in like thousands of voices to really understand what do the youth want. And I think what to me was quite interesting about this staff person who does the work of the Climate Change Youth Board is that his funding was crowdsourced by different members of the Climate Change Partnership. And so that to me was reflective of really the adults in this community recognizing that, you know, they should put their money where their mouth is. Youth participation is important, and they have stepped up and helped to fund this role. Another example, and I wanted to include just an example here of activism, because it is, I think, for local government, it's something that they have to learn to be comfortable with, to have moments of tension. And you can see it at the Fridays for Future level, at a national and international level, but when there's not youth coming to your office regularly, you may not be accustomed to working in this manner. So in Krakow, which is a population of nearly 800,000, with about a third of the people under the age of 30, they were able to push through this Krakow climate panel. And the climate panel is interesting because in Poland, they have this law where anytime you have a citizens' climate assembly, and I will say a citizens' climate assembly is where you have a group of residents who reflect what's the demographics of the community. So equal representation of men, of women, of different ethnic groups, different physical abilities. Those folks gather in a room and they make decisions, and they are selected at random. And in Poland, if you have any kind of citizens' assembly and you receive 80% or more of votes from the population to support these recommendations, they automatically are binding. They become law. So Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion in this community activists advocated for the creation of a citizens' climate assembly, and they were successful. They did so, and the citizens' assembly was set up, and 35 recommendations were developed. And when those recommendations were put to a vote for the broader Krakow community, 32 out of the 35 passed. So you can really see the Citizens' Assembly, it didn't necessarily reflect the youth population of the city, which still would have been, let's say, one representative. But you can see that in this way, youth can have a pretty significant impact on climate in this way of activism. So I will just end here, and I will just repeat for you some of my questions, but you can tell me yours. So I'm just curious to hear from you all, like, does this research interest you? What fears do you have about working with sustainability and urban planners and resilience planners on this kind of work? And are there values of youth work, as this work is being expressed to this audience, are there values of youth work that you feel like this audience really should understand? So yes, that's it. I thank you all for having me today.
Hello. Stay there, Violeta.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Before you said you have questions for them. So, question was how you find this relevant. But maybe you have questions to Violeta first. So, yes, you have a microphone on the.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the talk. Super interesting. I was really interested in all the different projects. I just have one question, because the theme of youth participation in politics is also so big for us. Maybe it's a difficult question, I don't know, but maybe you have an answer at hand. we are kind of critical towards methods like what is the name again? Youth parliaments, for example, because we kind of our experience with it is that it can often be some kind of fake participation. So maybe something that politicians might enable to show, oh look, we started this to enable youth participation, but in reality it's kind of a powerless institution. So maybe do you have any advice or are there maybe something how we can scan those different forms of youth participation in order to see if they really make a difference? You know what I mean? It's kind of a different question. Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, I totally agree, and when I put these local and regional types of youth participation, I wasn't privileging any over the other. I think in developing this guidance, I really want to emphasize that you do need this culture of like meaningful youth participation. The example that I am profiling in the research is a youth climate council in Denmark, and what made this council really meaningful is the staff person was really, the city staff person was really committed and understood that he needed to take a step back. And I cannot say that in any of these specific examples you will have meaningful participation, but I just want to highlight this, what are the conditions that support this this staff person to feel that this is the way that he should engage? And so in this example, he said, well, we worked with the Bremerhaven Youth Climate Council, and having this engagement with the staff person at the city there helped him realize, okay, this work is important, and they were actually in a sister city relationship. And he said this was actually the first. This was the first like real activity that they had as sister cities to work on with each other. And so it was this like shared experience and shared education at the staff level around what is meaningful youth participation in this way. I think one of the dangers of this work that I've seen is when this value is just with one staff person, he goes on to a new job, you may have lost that. So I think that is definitely a challenge to contend with.
Very interesting, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? You don't have a microphone there, or you do? You do, yes, actually. Yes.
Maybe I do.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you much for your presentation and sharing kind of the best case practices and showing that urban planners can care both about youth and being green. And just referring to your question to the audience about the perceptions, I can share a bit the concern of the environmental activists when they hear of urban planners. So there's a level of distrust because there's perception of what we have seen done to the large cities where they turn into urban jungle. So maybe these kind of looking long-term myths, or maybe some of them are true, could be dispelled into kind of fostering this collaboration between both youth workers, environmental activists or environmental workers, and the urban planners, to see that urban planners care not only about efficient jungle and increasing traffic in cities.
I appreciate that comment. I think part of what inspired this research is seeing that like cities want to do this work. They're like, hey, like it's happening at the national level. How can we ride this to kind of mobilize support? And I think that cities could be maybe too excited, too ambitious without taking a moment to reflect. Look at all the ways that we have both marginalized youth as we've done this work historically, and the ways in which we have privileged the car. We have privileged really very inefficient forms of city, and I think it is critical for also the recommendations to describe the ways in which local government needs to reflect on what's the histories that they come into the room with, and how that, you know, before they even open their mouth, how that destroys trust that needs to be repaired.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Andres. I bring you the mic.
Yeah, thanks. I was just asking, I mean, you were also asking us a question of what youth work practices and principles could maybe inform these kind of processes, but you've done quite a bit of research in different models and different examples. I'm just wondering, like we heard yesterday in Ireland, how the National Youth Council has been consulted and taken into consideration for designing a process of youth participation. Has there been any examples where youth work expertise has been consulted in any of these processes?
Yeah, I would say the Manchester example is one where I think you have more of this understanding that youth work is critical. In the examples I would see it, I would describe it as, it was often youth environmental groups who were working sort of in their own bubble and not working with other youth groups. And I think because of this, the Climate Change Youth Board, where you have many different youth who also have an experience in youth work, plus having a staff person who comes from this experience, that you know, this is like a living example of having this expertise every day that is at the table with adult decision makers. But I would definitely say this is one of the more unique examples where you do have groups that they work, you know, historically on climate and environment, and they don't necessarily see themselves in a larger ecosystem of youth. And so I think that's why I had this question. You know, this could inform both the sustainability and resilience professionals, but also the youth groups that only find themselves in working on environmental issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question there. It's just
Hello?
one. Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you, Violeta, because it was very interesting. I was just wondering, because you studied at what degree this is meaningful. I think it's very meaningful on the level of youth participation, everything that you showed us, but do we have any idea how meaningful it was on the level of climate action and on the level like what was the real ecological impact of this youth participation? Because it's very good for youth participation, but was it also very good for the climate action?
Yeah, I think that's something that I struggled with. In some of these interventions, it's just their time has not passed far enough. But I think like when I'm using this kind of urban climate governance, this is, I'm not necessarily thinking of what is the specific outcome around emissions reductions, the improvement of resilience, because these things have kind of just started to happen. But I think where you do see more immediate impact is things around like how are we articulating our climate goals? And so I would say in Germany in particular, I think many youth groups have been successful at accelerating the goals for having certain climate emissions reductions. So I think you're right in that this doesn't reflect, okay, we reduced emissions in this area by 10%. And I don't know if, for me, I don't think that is the goal of my research. I think for me, the goal is more around how do we enhance participation. I think my fear is that the impacts of climate change are only going to get worse, and yeah, they're only going to get worse and more extreme. And are we going to move in this space where everything is technocratically driven and how we make our decisions? So I think I was more interested to see like how is engagement changing, but I think in some instances you could be able to see like what is the emissions reductions. For example, I was speaking with not far from here. There's a German city, Eltville on the Rhine. They are a youth and child-friendly city, and this was again like a place that had a culture of youth participation. And they worked with a group of kind of Fridays for Future activists and the Youth Climate Council to amend their like drop-off zones in schools. So you know when you're a parent and you're dropping off your kid to school and you have to wait in line and idle for 10 or 15 minutes, the kids said like, hey, this is dumb. Like we want better air quality. We want to reduce the idling that happens. So let's establish like a drop-off points around the school so that you have less idling, and then we have kids who are able to walk to school together. So this was an arrangement both to reduce the idling and to have ways of young people to be able to hang out with each other and you know have a nice ride to work. So I think in that way they could you know measure how has air quality improved, to what degree has idling reduced. But I think for me, I had not prioritized to see what is the impact on the sustainability and resilience level, but could do some work to identify that could be a goal.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think we have two more questions and then we go for a group reflection. I think Guy first, but before Guy, I was really impressed, Violeta, with the slide that you showed that actually 50% of the goal can be potentially reached at local level. That was quite impressive, I think, especially talking about the local development and what actually the impact can be created on the local level. That was quite insightful. So Guy, yeah, you don't have mic, I blink you.
Thank you. It's fascinating to hear an American speak about Europe, really. It's fascinating. But I have a question for you about the United States of America. I was brought up, like I told you yesterday, from marching against the United States of America. It was the barely devil. It still is a little bit of an absurdistan for me, because my head is filled with prejudices and ignorance. So I would really like to hear from you, not today, but in a paper or something, about the way American local governments treat young people, how they to communicate with them. Are they involved? Is there something like a youth policy on the local level in American towns and cities? I don't know nothing about it, and it's terrible, but it's sure I don't know nothing. So please give us information. Maybe not now, but think about it, because I think I'm not the only one ignorant about what's happening in your big country. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll give you just a short response to that, because I don't have this experience in youth work, so it's also a question for me as I've been turning to Europe. Now I have more questions about the US, but the reason I came here is because in the US I would say it's this very much more antagonistic relationship, because there is not a structure, there's not an understanding that youth should have a role. And I would say it is not a distinctly American value, and so when you do see youth engaging with local decision makers, it is usually through protests and activism. And in the work that I was doing, where we were just starting to open up and say, hey, we need a space to have engagement. We don't want it to just be us talking at each other. And it wasn't clear, how do we do so? And I think that's just starting to happen in the US, like what are the kind of institutional ways and methods that we can support this work? And I will just say that I do have somewhat of a fear that, again, once we have these kind of like, okay, you have deliberative democracy, you have this and this, then we just say, okay, well, we have this climate council, we've done the work. So I think that's a great recommendation for me to go back and look a bit more, because now for me it is quite interesting as an American who does not have experience in youth work but has largely worked with local governments. Now I'm also scratching my head.
Thank you so much. One more, Lasse. No, wait, before Lasse. Yes, I don't have a mic.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's timely to start thinking of youth work actually engaging with already existing structures such as urban planning and stuff. So you talked a lot about my understanding of your presentation is the culture of youth participation already existing in areas such as local government already plays a big part on then the sort of youth participation you get or the sort of result. So I just wanted to know in your research, how much of that culture of youth participation at local level in Europe did you capture or see? Is it an existing thing and or not, or is half and half? And also knowing when it does exist, what motivates that? Is it the people, the staff that are present, or is it because there is some sort of documentation or some sort of charter coming from Europe or national level telling them the importance of including young people in the conversation? So is it depending on staff, which then moves around, or is it depending on a certain more grounded base that the youth sector, can also take advantage of if necessary? That's just my question.
Yeah. That's a big question for me. I would say I think in doing this research and somewhat you're cherry picking, you're looking for examples where this participation exists. So I don't think I could say that, yes, Europe has this great culture of at the urban level of participation. Some places, yes. I shared this slide on the new Leipzig Charter, and you know, you see some of these things in charters and in documents, and you talk to, for example, I was speaking with the Assembly on European Regions. To what extent is this like more critical thinking around engagement happening? And they said, yes, some of our members really ask us. They want the resources, but I can't say, you know, it's 30% of cities across Europe, but I do know that it is something that cities are, or city staff are thinking about when they think about how can I be successful in my job. I think they know that engagement is critical and part of that work, but how they actually balance that with the responsibilities of their job, of creating plans, of engaging with the other folks in city government, and all of this, I don't know actually to what extent they're balancing this value that I think many of them have, and there's, you know, tools developed for them to do so. But I can't say with any certainty to what extent folks are actually doing so. You asked me what are the things that really encourage this, and I think it's personal values. I think just like when we talk about what are the values that you come to with youth work, I think in sustainability and resilience and urban planning, it's similarly. I think some people, I think we're for sure in this moment of reflection on to the extent to which our institutions are democratic. So I had this chart, some over here. Yeah, this chart on you know, some of the values around participation. I think in local government there is this feeling of, well, we need to be able to legitimize our decisions, and so that does push people to say we do need to enhance, you know, the transparency of our work. We need to have more methods of engagement. But I can't say to what extent, you know, this goes from a check to really people being quite critical of the ways in which they are doing so. I spoke with some folks from C40 Cities, which is a global network of cities working on climate action. And they're actually, I think in the next month or so, developing this guide just for cities on how to engage youth better. And I was asking them, you know, what are some of the things that you have you found as like really critical messages to share? And I think you'll be happy with some of them. I think there was some reflection to say like, okay, trust and relationships really matter. So I think that there's this direction that is saying that, at least for city governments, to say like we need to think more critically about how we develop participation methods and processes, but I think it's ultimately going to be driven by what are the professional demands that they have, what are the kind of directives that they're getting from their boss, which is generally the mayor, and then just personally, what do they come with in their hearts as they come to work.
Yes, thank you, Violeta, for the presentation, and just to give a short reply on Guy's request on youth policy structures and rights in USA and your work. In USA, I think youth policy boils down very much to the fact that the USA is the only country in the world which hasn't signed the Children's Rights Convention, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which tells a story. And the story is that, in fact, in many places, people actually don't think that young people have rights. Why should they have rights then adopted on an international forum? And it's an interesting country because there are very different kinds of states which have different kinds of political cultures, and there is one state which is the Vermont state, which is Bernie Sanders' state, which incidentally thinks a little bit differently on things than many of the other states. And in Vermont, there is an amazing thing, which where there the local youth work have worked with the kids, and the young people in Vermont have published a charter of young people's rights in Vermont. Imagine in a country which itself doesn't acknowledge that young people have rights. There is a state where the children have declared their own rights, and they go through, for example, your table, which is in the back of you. So they cover young people's rights every field of the area, and that's kind of their youth policy program. And that is also prepared with the in dialogue with the local government, with the state authorities in Montpellier, and they also have established kind of a body. I don't know if they call it youth council, but it's a body consisting of gradually changing young people, who the young people elect themselves, which is kind of implementing this charter. So there are interesting places, and maybe that's something that you could also have a closer look. It's an amazing exception and an interesting place. It's Vermont After School, which is the organizational runner of this thing, or this process.
Thank you for that.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot, Violeta, for waking us up and stimulating discussions in the second day of Offenburg Talks. A big applause for you and for your research.